How many of you have ever had a song stuck in your brain? This happens to me a lot. I have a songbird of a daughter. It's like, I heard music. Did you hear music? It's like stuck in our brain right there. You know, I have a songbird of a daughter who constantly sings at home. And this week, the song that she was singing was The Greatest Showman. So I find, particular songs, get lodged. And so this week it was that song that was lodged in my brain, This Is Me. So I'm like, I can be walking up aisle 8 of Mitre 10, oogling over the barbecues, and I begin to hum, This Is Me, woo. And then I can be heading off to Countdown and grabbing some milk and not really fully aware of it, but, I can be singing, I'm not scared to be seen. I make no apology. This is me, and crazy things happen, don't they? As you can see when songs get stuck in our brains. And perhaps the bumper that we're using in this series might do that for you. You might be driving home after the service and it begins to play in your mind. And hours go by and you find yourself at the kitchen sink and again, you start to hear that song playing in your brain. If it weren't for your love, where would I be? And you go to bed tonight and you think, well, that must be the end of it. But tomorrow morning you wake up and you're in the shower and lo and behold, it's there again. And if you've been in this situation, this can go on for days. And that's not bad if it's a pleasant song like this one, but it can be terrible if it is a song that grates on you. This is often called an earworm or a brainworm. In fact, there's another fancy word for it. I love this phrase, involuntary music syndrome. And no one knows why imagined songs just get kind of stuck or lodged in our heads. But researchers say there's just this, music is this incredibly powerful thing that goes on in our memory that we can kind of remember the tune and it's like it's still playing in our brains. I'm going to talk today about a different type of song that plays again and again, like on repeat, over and over and over again. It's not a pop rock tune, but the lyrics of this song would go something like this. Why wasn't I appreciated? Why wasn't I noticed? Why wasn't I included? Why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? It's a song that plays again and again and again in our brain as we move from activity to activity, day after day, week after week, year after year. The party invitations are sent out, but she discovers she's not on the list. And the loop starts playing. Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? He was promoted to like national sales manager. She was honored like employee of the month again. I mean, you're kidding, right? Or you're scrolling through social media and look at the picture. I mean, why are they always with beautiful people in those beautiful places? Or she can't be that thin. It's probably just the way she's standing. Or why her? Why not me? Why him and not me? Why them and not us? It's a song that just loops in our brain. Why wasn't I appreciated? Why wasn't I noticed? Why wasn't I included? Why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? Question, which line of that song most resonates with you at the moment? Which line tends to play over and over on repeat in your brain? Second question, what would it take to replace that song with a different tune, a positive tune that will lead to joy? Because we all know that that first song that plays on repeat, that won't lead to joy in our lives. It just really leads to relational difficulty and just crazy things that happen in us. But what would it look like to change that tune? Now, the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at this letter that St. Paul wrote to a group of Jesus followers in the city of Philippi. And as we come to chapter 2 of this letter called Philippians in the New Testament of our Bibles, we come to a church that's facing a whole lot of relational difficulties. Effectively, some of them are out of tune with each other. It's like they're singing from a really bad song sheet, and there's this relational carnage that's happening. And Paul's desire is that they would all come together and be in sync with each other. And so he writes this. Would you make my joy complete, my joy? That's a common theme in this book. We've already seen this, haven't we? It's the word joy or rejoicing is used 16 times in like 104 verses. And Paul says, make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. It doesn't mean that everyone has to have the same thoughts on every single thing. He's not saying that. But he's saying, would you just be in harmony together? Because Paul knows when people are in harmony, there is this similar beat and a joy that erupts from that whole scenario. And he's not talking about the way we all need to sit around a campfire and sing Kumbaya. He's actually talking about the difficulties we face in the ordinariness of day-and-day life when people hurt us or say things about us, or there's a misunderstanding, or we haven't been invited, or we haven't been consulted. Paul thinks we can actually still experience harmony together. Now, again, people in this church in Philippi are currently out of sync with each other. And so he stares the problem in the face, and he gives a solution to that problem, and it's a very different solution to what we think it would be. He says, the problem is you're focused on yourselves. The solution is you need to begin to focus more on the interests of others. Effectively, Paul's trying to give them a new song to hum. It's a song that's quite easy to remember. It's like 2, 3, 4. It's a beat. Philippians 2, chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. 2, 3, 4. Can you say it with me? 2, 3, 4. It has this beautiful beat, and this is what he writes. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Again, it says easy to remember this verse as that beat 2, 3, 4, because they're singing currently to a different tune. Why wasn't I appreciated? Why wasn't I noticed? Why wasn't I included? Why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? And that song has to be washed away from our thinking. It's got to go, he says. So how does that happen? Because I'm sure you've noticed that the more you try to get these songs out of your mind, the more it's like they embed and like concrete is poured around that song and we can't get away from it. And that's what happens in our relational conflicts, isn't it? The more we dwell on what he said and what she did and what they promised, and we try to move it out of our mind, but it's like this song just plays on repeat and we can't move on and we just get stuck. But as I've said before, a good movement pushes out bad movement. You need to dislodge the old narrative by replacing it with something new and positive and different. Who isn't seen? Who isn't heard? Who needs my smile? Who needs my words? Okay, Paul's trying to teach us to teach them that we need to dance to a new beat. Again, 2, 3, 4. Can you say these words of this verse out loud with me? Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Now remember that they're receiving these very words for a reason. They're in a culture, not just the culture around them, but a culture within their church that's denigrating others. Later he's going to say, do nothing out of complaining or arguing. Why? Well, because they're complaining and they're arguing. It's one thing after another. It's that sigh, it's the rolled eyes, it's the knowing stares, it's the picky comments, it's the words muttered under the breath, it's the complaining when things just haven't gone my way. Later he's going to publicly call out a couple of people who just aren't getting along. And he begs them to sort out their differences. Now I realize that none of us connecting here today have ever experienced a culture of arguing or complaining. This is absolutely zero relevance to you and me, right? And of course, if you have ever actually experienced arguing or complaining, it's always someone else who is to blame in these situations. Have you noticed this? Okay, we know full well, I think we're all kind of nodding away in those beautiful smiles you have, that we've been on the receiving end of this and we've probably been on the giving end of this, because this is part and parcel of every single relationship. It's what happens in friendships, it's what happens in work, it happens in church environments. We complain and we argue, and that all kind of eventually is able to trace its way back to something that happened when he said that, or she did that, or they promised X, Oftentimes, or sometimes it's actually a real thing. Sometimes, what I find most of the time, it's a misunderstanding that's happened. What I find really interesting, though, here in Philippians chapter 2 is Paul doesn't actually speak about the external situation, about what happened. He doesn't take sides. He doesn't even weigh in on the merits of who's right and who's wrong, or even the misunderstanding that might have happened. Instead, he just seems to see that all as secondary. Instead, he takes the time to unpack what he sees as the root problem. There's a song playing in your head. This constant repeat. It's a song about you. And if things are going to change, you actually need to change the song, that narrative that's going on, and move away the focus from yourself to be more focused on the interests of others. Oh, suddenly silence in the room. I mean, this is paradoxical, isn't it? This is the complete reversal of the way we would normally respond to conflict. So see, Paul calls them to abandon a life of self-interest and self-focus, and in its place to run a new song through our mind that keeps in step with what it means to be recipient of the grace and the forgiveness and love of Jesus. It's like Paul yells out to us, unity dances to the beat of humility. Unity dances to the beat of humility. If you want to experience the joy of harmony, well, dance to the beat of humility. If you want to experience the oneness of relationships, then dance to the beat of humility. And before you say, okay, got it, JD, okay, pride, bad, humility, better, got it, let's just get home. But not so fast. Because I think most of us tend to underestimate how hard this can be. And I think we also underestimate how destructive and insidious pride is in all of our relationships with each other. I also think we underestimate how healing humility can be if we would just have that posture of humility, how relationships could actually come back together again. One of the difficulties of pride is that it is a sin that hides itself. I like to think of it as the carbon monoxide of sin. It's like odorless. It's hard to even know it's there at times, particularly in our own lives. As I've said before, other sins might be easier to spot. You know when you're embezzling somebody. You look at your bank account, you see that $500,000 sitting there and you go, what, I don't make $500,000 a year? or when you're having an affair. You never wake up next to somebody and say, oh my gosh, you're not my wife. It's really easy to know what's happening. Pride is much harder to spot. It might be relatively easy to see in somebody else. It's a lot harder to see in ourselves. Well, we all know it's easier to point the finger at someone on somebody's situation, and we fail to see the three fingers, right, pointing back at us, probably on that same issue that we're accusing somebody else of. And much of this reason is we just fail to understand what pride is and how pride works. A Christian author, C.S. Lewis, defined it well. He said, pride is the ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on the, say it, self. We often think of a proud person as the one who boasts of his or her achievements. They stand on the podium and they want everybody to have to see them in the spotlight, and they're the one that's succeeded. And that might be part of it, but it's not about just having achieved, because somebody that hasn't achieved, that hasn't got to that number one part of the podium, can still be just as proud. Because at the heart of pride, it's not actually about achievement, it's actually about the ego. It's about the ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on the self. It's that song that plays in our minds. Why wasn't I appreciated? Why wasn't I noticed? Why wasn't I included? Why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? It's about the I, the ego. You see, whether the situation was your fault or whether it was the fault of somebody else or whether it was just a misunderstanding, it comes back to the ego. He said, she said, they promised. There's this relational rift there, ultimately because you're feeling it because your ego is damaged. And Paul wants these followers of Jesus in ancient Philippi to replace that old tune that needs to go with a whole new tune. So it gives them a song in verses 6 to 11 of chapter 2. And if you're looking at a printed Bible, it looks something like this. Notice verses 6 to 11 are indented in the way this is laid out. And normally you would do that, like, if you're a student here and you're writing an essay, sometimes you do that like when you have a long quote from somebody, or where it's like it might be a poem or something like that. And that's why this is done like this. As scholars look at verses 6 to 11, they say it's either a creed or an ancient poem, or it's a song, and most seem to land on the fact that this is a song, an old song that the church is singing away. So why was this song written? Well, I think people wanted these words to be remembered. Paul is telling them this song because I think he wants this song to be so looping around in the circuits of our brains. So Paul draws from this ancient song to replace it with the one that's way too common in our lives. He wants this song to be played repeat in our minds because Paul knows how revolutionary this is, and this can be, in the way it can transform our relationships from grumbling and complaining to appreciating and respecting. And so he introduces this song with these words in verse 5. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Before you jump in and you point the finger at somebody else and, he said and she said and they promised, I just want you to stand back and I want you to start playing this song about Jesus in your brains. And how might that new song about Jesus affect the way you see and feel about your situation? So it begins with Jesus at the very top of the podium. Now, I realize some of you aren't really musical people. You might be more sports people. So let's go with the sports analogy for a little bit. Because we're going to have a lot of sports in New Zealand over the next few weeks and months. We've got a FIFA Women's World Cup. We've got the Rugby World Cup later in the year. A whole lot of teams playing. But there's only one team that is going to be able to stand right on the top of a podium and say, we won. We're the greatest. We're right at the very top of the podium. And this is where the song about Jesus begins. We read in verse 6, though he was God. I mean, you can't get any higher than where Jesus starts from on the podium. Higher echelon than you can go. He's not a vice president to God. He's not a runner-up to God. He's not a lesser God. He has all the divine essence of what makes God, God. He's the one who crafted the galaxies, who crafted the mountains and the valleys and reaches out to people like you and me, all of us, because he had experienced the love between his Father and himself, and he wants others to come into that same love. And yet this verse states that he had a very different framework. It says, though he was God, he didn't think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he takes a step down. He didn't think of equality with God as something to cling to. Jesus is dancing to a different beat. It's a beat of humility. Even in our culture today, when we hear the word humility, we do think of it as a virtue. We actually think of it as a positive trait that we would like to embody, and we'd like to see it more embodied in others. It's unfamiliar ground. When Paul's talking about humility, it's in a culture where humility wasn't a virtue at all. In fact, the word humility and humiliation really meant the same thing. And so the only time humility, or every time you find the word humility outside of the Bible, at that time, it was always a negative word. It might refer to the person who loses the fight, a person who doesn't make it on the podium to win. It was always a degrading term. And yet Paul takes this word and talks about it as a virtue that we are meant to embody, expressed in what Jesus himself did. It's interesting, the highest value in Roman society was philotimos, the love of honor, the love of status, of being at the top. And so when people would be in dialogue with each other, they would ask questions like, well, who were your parents? Were you born to parents of nobility? Which city were you born in? Were you born in a Roman city of prestige? What do you do? How many employees, or at that time, how many slaves do you have? And people would do these like mental calculations and assess where you were on the podium. And once you got yourself there, you were always fighting to get higher and higher on the podium. Jesus does the opposite, doesn't he? He has the highest position, and yet he doesn't cling to it. He releases it. It's interesting why our culture would say we value humility as a virtue. We tend to do something different, probably different to Roman times. We talk a lot about rights in our society, and that's actually come from a lot of Christian beliefs. We want to hold up the right of humanity and the right to life, and everybody has inherent dignity, and there is a right to that. At the same time, what tends to happen is we tend to cling on to these rights. And what I've found that the reason we tend to argue and complain is because there is a breach of rights, either perceived or real, and so we cling on to that right. Jesus does something very different. We would say, well, I wasn't invited, I wasn't consulted, I wasn't included, my rights have been breached. The remarkable thing here in this verse is Jesus did have rights, divine rights. He had the right to be appreciated. He deserved to be noticed. He deserved to be included. He deserved to be invited into the conversations. But none of this was coming his way as God. And even though he's not the cause of the problems, he's not the problem, he takes a step down. Instead of grumbling or complaining, he did something paradoxical. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges, his divine rights. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. It's like another step down the podium, isn't it? Now, as he steps down, it's not denying the fact that he's still God. Nothing in his essence is changing. And as he humbles himself, he's not acknowledging that, actually, I'm not due these rights. He is due these rights. It's just he's not clinging on to them. He's releasing them for the sake of the relationship because he knows there was a relational strain between God and us. And so Jesus is the one who voluntarily humbles himself for the sake of the relationship. You see, for Jesus, his focus isn't on himself and what he's worthy of and clinging to that. And he's giving it away because he wants to restore the relationship. And so he proactively and voluntarily does what he needs to do to bring us into relationship with him. Again, important to highlight, Jesus is not the cause of the problems, we were. But instead of grasping what he's entitled to or complaining about what he's not getting, Jesus voluntarily steps down and down and down. This is what we sing about at Christmas, isn't it? It's the Christmas story. O come, Emmanuel. All of that part of the story. How God became one of us, a human being, restricting himself to time and space. This is the majesty and mystery of the Christmas story. And even think about the way Jesus doesn't just give up his divine rights, but even gives up his rights as a human being. He didn't birth himself into the ruling Roman class. He didn't choose a middle-class family with the financial means to give him a head start in society. He made himself nothing. He put himself in the hands of a poor couple from a conquered nation in a backward town called Nazareth. So backward, people would say at the time, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He took on the likeness of humanity completely. He got hungry, he got tired. When he worked as a carpenter, he would still get splinters into his palms. He understood our weakness and the difficulties and the mess of this world, and yet he would still step down and serve. I mean, other people would say, I'm not going to do that job because it really is beneath me. Jesus gets down and he takes a bowl of water and he washes his disciples' feet. Somebody said before that the real test of a servant is that when you're treated like a servant, you act like a servant. Jesus is God. And yet he voluntarily takes this downward step to serve. Although the owner of all things, he gave up his right to even own a home here on earth. Although it's right for people to sing, you are worthy of it all, he allowed people to shout at him, you're a Samaritan and demon-possessed. Though he was rich, we read, yet for our sakes he became poor. You see the way Jesus is releasing his rights, releasing his rights, releasing his rights. Instead of bickering and complaining or arguing, he takes this downward step and steps into the mess himself in order to restore the relationship. Do you see how Jesus is dancing to a very different beat? He's not singing that old tune, why wasn't I appreciated, why wasn't I noticed? Instead, he steps down. And we move from the Christmas story to the Easter story because there's another step. It says when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. It's another step, isn't it? It's one thing to die, it's another to die in shame when everyone is looking at you as being like a criminal, even though you've done nothing. And he dies this torturous, painful death. The crucifixion didn't simply kill people, but rather torture them so they would feel every single ounce of that death to its fullest. It's been said that the person who was crucified died 1,000 deaths. It's also a degrading death. That they view Jesus' death as the death of a criminal, and Jesus hangs there bearing the sin of the entire world, utterly disgraced, and yet he's innocent. See, it's one thing, isn't it, to give up your rights and serve. It's another when you're doing something for somebody else and they slap you across the face, or in this case, they crucify you. Such is his incredible focus on the needs of others rather than himself. And why did he do all this? Because Jesus knew that through the incarnation, the Christmas story, and through the Easter story of his sacrifice, others, you and me, could actually have the opportunity to come into relationship with God. That we read elsewhere in the gospel accounts, the Son of Man, this Jesus came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. His focus wasn't on himself, it was on the interests of other people. He wasn't stewing over the injustice, the rights, the entitlements, the things that were wrongly said about him. His focus was on us. And so he took these downward steps, step after step after step after step, in order to heal the relationship. And remember why Paul's writing these beautiful words about Jesus? He's giving us this beautiful song because he wants us to play this song over and over in our minds, because he wants us to dance to a very different beat, the beat of humility. Because unity dances to the beat of humility. Remember, it's a different beat. 2, 3, 4. Can we read this verse out again? Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. See, Paul knows when we would actually do that, we will actually experience a joy of relational harmony, because we're all dancing to a very different beat from what we see in our wider culture. And this is such a radically different tune to what goes on in that narrative in our heads. But it's not fear. If people don't realize my title, who's going to notice? He did that, she did that, they promised that. Nobody said this would be easy. And nobody ever said this was normal. Again, don't underestimate how hard this is. But equally, don't underestimate the healing power that comes when there is a posture of humility, where transformative change and Christian unity can actually be experienced. See, again, our problem is something's wrong with our ego. Our ego is swollen, it's inflamed, it's always making us think about ourselves, how we're treated. He said that, she said that. Author Timothy Keller illustrates it so well, and I've used this illustration before, but he says, have you ever thought about how your body is, you don't notice the parts of your body until something's wrong with it. For instance, if I your toes, you never really think about your toes unless something's wrong with your toes, or when a communicator at the front starts to talk about your toes, and it's like, oh, yeah, I can feel my toes right now. It's only when we start to think about it. And the only reason we start to feel parts in our body is when something is wrong with those parts of our body. Body only draws attention to itself when something's wrong with it. And the reason our ego hurts is because something is wrong with our ego. It's swollen, it's inflamed. It's always making us think about how we look and how we're treated and how we feel. Again, walking around doesn't hurt my toes unless there's something wrong with it. My ego wouldn't hurt unless something's wrong with it, terribly wrong with it. And so we feel snubbed, we feel ignored, and we start to sing that ditty. Why wasn't I appreciated? Why wasn't I noticed? Why wasn't I included? Why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I invited? Why wasn't I promoted? All because there's something wrong with our sense of self, with my identity. Friends, this is why Jesus could express such humility for you and me. Because for Jesus, his ego was so healthy, it was so secure in his love from the Father that he knew nothing could ever be taken away from him. That love could never go. So he was able to have a focus on us rather than himself. Jesus was so confident about the destination ahead of him that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It never made it easy, but it made it possible. The rest of the song tells us what happened. Because of the humility, the downward steps Jesus took, the Father elevates him. God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name that is above every other name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. You see, Jesus is so secure in the love of his Father that he can forgo the right to be noticed from others. Jesus is so secure in the name that his Father will give him that he's able to endure the slander of what others might say about him. And that security is what enabled Jesus to release his hold on his rights and his position, to give up even basic respect. Instead, he danced to a very different beat of humility. And as a result, God elevated him to the highest place. But we say, yeah, but who's going to work on my status? I mean, if I don't, who's going to do it? It's like our Creator whispers to us, that's my job. Well, if people don't realize my title, who's going to notice? And the Father again whispers, I'll give you a name. Well, it's just not fair. Well, neither was it for Jesus. He said that, she said that, they did that, they promised. Well, I see you at your worst, and yet I still love you and I forgive you and I accept you. I'm a very sensitive individual. The more you get to know me, you realize probably how sensitive I can be. So I can find a lot of this incredibly hard in learning the way I need to keep preaching the gospel to myself. Because when I meet other leaders, I find that I tend to be more on the more sensitive spectrum of where leaders tend to be. My skin just isn't as thick. And ultimately, I know that my ego needs a lot of healing. It needs these constant reminders of the gospel. So see, what I need is the continual awareness of the way the Father loves and accepts me. And when I have that, I'm able to park those unfiltered comments or unjust criticism that we all tend to experience in life. I'm still growing in this, but I'm noticing the more I replace the old song with the new song, the less those negative traits like arguing and complaining are common in my life, and replace more with those positive traits I want to experience. Humility and gratitude, they start to become more common in my life. You see, if you allow Jesus to fill up your ego in a healthy way, you will be strong enough to choose roles where you serve, perhaps even without any recognition. You'll be able to take on a job where you might be underappreciated, a calling that might be misunderstood or incredibly painful. You'll be able to bite your tongue and listen to others without having to be the one who's always heard. If you allow Jesus to fill up your ego in a healthy way, you'll be able to let things go. Provide basic respect for other people and understanding. See, my prayer is that all of us would allow the Spirit of God to work in us in such a way, in our resolve to replace the negative song that plays overtime in our lives with this beautiful song that Paul gives to us about Jesus. Let me read it again. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Church, let's have that song played on repeat. reminding us that Jesus danced to a very different tune, a tune that leads to relational harmony, a tune that brings the joy of unity, because unity dances to the beat of humility. And so Jesus, would you help us in this? Many of us realize just how bruised and swollen our egos are. And we need this good news to provide healing, to realize just how much you love us, how much you accept us, the name that you give to us, the way we have nothing to fear because we're in relationship with you. We pray that out of that we would be able to release things in our lives. It's pretty hard to think about that, Jesus, when a lot of hurt has been done. But by your Spirit, would you continue to bring healing and help us to model or pursue the way that you showed us, and the way you took downward step after step after step in order to heal relationships. So Jesus, continue to bring healing, and would you help us to live a distinctive way of life? It's so paradoxical. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. Amen.